They said if he could sit through one dinner with the woman everyone laughed at, they'd call him a saint. They thought he would walk away in less than 30 seconds. They were wrong. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm golden light across polished oak floors, while the soft notes of a string quartet drifted through the air like a quiet prayer no one was listening to anymore. Laughter floated between round tables dressed in white linen, but not all laughter carried joy. Some of it carried judgment. Some of it carried cruelty disguised as humor. Daniel Brooks stood near the entrance, one hand gently resting on the shoulder of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. His charcoal blazer wasn't expensive, but it was neatly pressed. His worn leather shoes had been polished until they reflected the lights overhead. Years of raising a child alone had taught him that dignity was never measured by price tags. Lily looked up at her father with bright blue eyes that still believed every room held the possibility of kindness. "Daddy, are we late?" she whispered. Daniel smiled softly. "Right on time, sweetheart." Across the ballroom, whispers began to spread like ripples across still water. Heads turned toward a woman sitting alone at the far corner table. No one occupied the chairs beside her. Guests glanced in her direction only long enough to look away again. Some hid amused smiles behind champagne glasses. Others leaned closer to exchange quiet comments that made their companions chuckle. Emily Carter lowered her eyes to the untouched plate in front of her. The elegant navy dress she wore was simple, almost intentionally invisible, but nothing could hide the pale scars tracing one side of her face. They had become the first thing strangers noticed, and the only thing many believed mattered. She had grown used to silence. She had grown even more accustomed to the laughter that came before it. At the center of the room, the charity gala host stepped onto the stage holding a microphone. His cheerful grin suggested another light-hearted surprise was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we've prepared one final icebreaker before dinner is served." Several guests laughed with anticipation. Daniel barely paid attention as Lily admired the floral centerpiece nearby. "Tonight," the host continued, scanning the room theatrically, "our guest Daniel Brooks has been randomly selected to join Miss Emily Carter at the featured table." A burst of laughter erupted almost instantly. Someone muttered, "Poor guy." Another voice answered, "Bet he asks for another seat." A woman near the back covered her smile with her napkin, while a man quietly shook his head as though Daniel had just lost an impossible bet. Lily looked around, confused by the reaction. Daniel remained perfectly still. For one long moment, the room waited. They expected discomfort. They expected hesitation. They expected embarrassment. Instead, Daniel calmly picked up Lily's small hand and began walking toward the lonely table. Every footstep echoed softly across the ballroom until even the string quartet seemed to fade into the background. Emily slowly lifted her eyes, clearly preparing herself for another awkward apology, another excuse, another polite rejection wrapped in forced kindness. Daniel reached the table, pulled out the chair beside hers with quiet respect, then looked at her with the same warm expression he offered every neighbor, every customer, every stranger who crossed his path. "Good evening," he said gently. "Would you mind if my daughter and I joined you?" Emily blinked, unable to answer immediately. Lily smiled first. "Hi, I think your dress is really pretty." The laughter disappeared as quickly as it had begun. Glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. Conversations dissolved into complete silence. And for the first time that evening, the only thing anyone in that ballroom could hear was the sound of one woman's heart remembering what simple human kindness felt like. Daniel waited until Emily was comfortably seated before taking his own chair. Then he helped Lily settle beside him with the quiet patience that had become second nature over the past 5 years. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, but they sounded different now. The laughter had softened into whispers, and the whispers carried curiosity instead of confidence. Daniel noticed none of it. He unfolded his napkin, smiled at Lily, and thanked the waiter as though this table was no different from any other in the room. That was the remarkable thing about him. He never treated kindness as a performance. It was simply the way he had chosen to live after life had taken almost everything else away. Every morning before sunrise, Daniel unlocked the doors of Brooks Custom Woodworks on the edge of Maple Ridge, a quiet town where people knew one another's names and often believed they knew one another's stories. His shop smelled of fresh cedar, maple sawdust, and strong black coffee. Customers admired the furniture he built by hand, but few understood why every bookshelf, dining table, and rocking chair received the same careful attention. Daniel believed that anything made for a family deserved to be built with love. That belief had carried him through long winters, slow business seasons, and lonely evenings after his wife, Hannah, passed away from an illness that had arrived without warning. Since then, every decision had begun with one simple question. What would be best for Lily? She had become the center of his world, not because he wished to shelter her from every hardship, but because he wanted her to grow into someone whose heart remained gentle no matter how difficult life became. He never measured success by the balance in his bank account. He measured it by whether Lily still believed people were worth trusting. On Saturday mornings, they volunteered together at the local food pantry. On Sundays, they carried homemade pies to elderly neighbors who rarely had visitors. Daniel never announced these small acts, and Lily never thought they were unusual. To her, helping people was simply what families did. Once, after leaving the grocery store, Lily had watched her father quietly return a dropped $20 bill to an elderly man who had not realized it had fallen from his pocket. When she asked why he had not kept it because nobody would have known, Daniel had knelt beside her shopping cart and answered with words she never forgot. Character is what you do when nobody is keeping score. She repeated those words often, sometimes without realizing it. At school, when another child was sitting alone during lunch, Lily carried her tray to the empty seat. When a new student looked frightened on the first day, she introduced herself before anyone else could. Daniel never asked her to become extraordinary. He only showed her, one ordinary moment at a time, that respect could change someone's entire day. Back inside the ballroom, Lily looked at Emily with the same open curiosity she offered every person she met. She noticed the gentle way Emily thanked the waiter. She noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she reached for her water glass. Most of all, she noticed the sadness hidden behind her quiet smile. Lily leaned a little closer to her father and whispered, just softly enough that only he could hear, "Daddy, why were they laughing at her?" Daniel glanced around the room before meeting his daughter's eyes. His expression remained calm, but there was a sadness behind it that only Lily recognized. He gently squeezed her small hand beneath the table and answered, "Sometimes people notice what is different before they notice what is beautiful. We are going to do better than that." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, not because she was ashamed, but because kindness had become unfamiliar enough to feel almost overwhelming. She wrapped both hands around her water glass, letting its cool surface steady the emotions rising inside her. For years, she had mastered the quiet art of disappearing into crowded rooms. It was easier that way. If she arrived unnoticed, perhaps she could leave before anyone whispered. Unfortunately, life rarely granted her that mercy. There had been a time when Emily Carter walked into hospitals instead of banquet halls. Long before people remembered her for the scars on her face, they remembered her calm voice, her patient smile, and the way frightened children relaxed the moment she entered a room. She had devoted nearly 12 years to pediatric medicine, believing every child deserved to feel safe even during the hardest days of their lives. Parents trusted her. Nurses admired her steady compassion. Colleagues often joked that she never seemed to tire because her heart always reached patients before her hands did. Then one terrible afternoon changed everything. The emergency that followed left permanent reminders across one side of her face. The physical healing eventually came, But the life she had known quietly disappeared. Friends promised they would stay close, yet phone calls became less frequent. Invitations slowly stopped arriving. Her engagement ended with a carefully written letter that spoke of impossible futures instead of lasting love. She never argued. She simply folded the letter, placed it inside a drawer, and decided that some kinds of heartbreak did not need witnesses. Rather than return to a hospital where every curious glance reminded her of what had changed, Emily accepted a position managing the charitable foundation her late parents had established years earlier. She spent her days funding children's clinics, paying for surgeries families could not afford, and quietly delivering scholarships to students who would never know her name. The foundation's annual gala had always been important because every dollar raised helped someone begin again. Ironically, it had also become the one evening each year she dreaded the most. Wealthy donors praised generosity from the stage while quietly measuring appearances at their tables. Emily understood the contradiction better than anyone. Across the ballroom, a woman wearing sparkling diamond earrings leaned toward her husband and whispered something that ended with a sympathetic smile aimed directly at Emily. Another guest glanced over before quickly looking away, embarrassed to have been caught staring. Emily had learned to recognize every version of pity. Some people offered silence. Others offered excessive kindness that felt rehearsed. Very few offered normal conversation. Daniel, however, had asked about nothing except whether she preferred sparkling or still water. He had complimented the floral arrangements because he noticed she had been admiring them. He spoke about Lily's latest attempt to bake blueberry muffins that had somehow turned purple instead of blue, and Lily immediately protested that they still tasted wonderful. For the first time that evening, Emily laughed. It was a small laugh, soft enough that only the people at her table heard it, but it carried something that had been missing from her life for a very long time. Daniel smiled. Not because he believed he had accomplished anything remarkable, but because hearing another person laugh was reason enough to be grateful. Emily looked at him with quiet curiosity. Most people eventually asked about her scars. Some did it delicately. Others could not hide their fascination. Daniel had not looked at them once. Finally, unable to contain her curiosity, she asked in a gentle voice, "You have not asked what happened to my face." Daniel met her eyes with the same calm expression he had worn since sitting down. He smiled faintly before answering, "Because I was much more interested in learning your name than your pain." Emily's answer lingered between them long after Daniel finished speaking. She had spent years preparing herself for uncomfortable questions, curious glances, and carefully disguised sympathy. She had never prepared herself for someone who simply accepted her presence without demanding an explanation. The orchestra eased into another gentle melody, and the warm glow from dozens of candles reflected across crystal glasses, giving the ballroom the peaceful appearance of a place where every heart belonged. Yet beneath that elegant surface, quiet judgment continued to drift from table to table. Daniel noticed a waiter approaching with the first course and immediately stood to help move Emily's chair slightly closer to the table before sitting back down himself. It was such a simple gesture that most people would have overlooked it, but Emily noticed. She had spent years observing the smallest acts because genuine respect often revealed itself in details too ordinary for others to appreciate. Lily reached for a dinner roll and smiled at Emily. "Daddy always says food tastes better when nobody eats alone." Emily looked at the little girl, her eyes suddenly shining with emotion she could not hide. "Your father sounds like a very wise man." Lily giggled. "He says he is still learning every day." Daniel laughed softly and shook his head. "That part is true." The easy conversation continued as though the three of them had shared countless dinners before. They spoke about favorite books, autumn weather, old family recipes, and Lily's dream of planting a butterfly garden behind their small house next spring. Emily found herself describing the tiny herb garden outside her cottage, where rosemary somehow survived every harsh winter while everything else struggled. Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that had nothing to do with her appearance. Across the ballroom, however, not everyone appreciated what they were witnessing. A businessman seated nearby leaned toward another guest and quietly said, "He is trying too hard." His companion shrugged. "Maybe he wants people to notice how kind he is." Neither man realized Daniel could easily hear them. He simply continued buttering Lily's dinner roll before placing it gently on her plate. Character, he often reminded himself, did not become real when people applauded it. Character became real when criticism failed to change it. A few minutes later, the master of ceremonies returned to the stage with a broad smile. "Before our keynote speaker begins," he announced, "we would love to recognize a few guests who have shown extraordinary compassion in our community." Polite applause filled the ballroom. The host began inviting several donors to stand as their charitable contributions were described. Cameras flashed while guests applauded with practiced enthusiasm. During the recognition, one photographer wandered toward Daniel's table. He smiled politely and asked if Daniel, Lily, and Emily would mind posing together for a picture supporting the foundation. Emily instinctively hesitated. She had learned to avoid cameras whenever possible. Daniel noticed the uncertainty in her eyes before the photographer did. "Only if everyone at this table feels comfortable," he said gently. "Nobody should ever feel pressured into a photograph." The photographer immediately nodded with understanding. "Of course." Emily looked at Daniel for a long moment before offering a quiet smile. "Actually," she said softly, "I think I would like one." Lily beamed with excitement as they gathered together. The camera flashed once. No forced smiles. No awkward distance. Just three people sharing a perfectly ordinary moment. As the photographer walked away, Emily looked down at the image on the camera screen for a brief second before it disappeared. She realized something almost impossible had happened. For the first time in many years, she had not wondered how her scars looked in the picture. She had only wondered whether the smiles looked real. The applause faded as the final recognition concluded, leaving behind the soft hum of conversations and the delicate clinking of silverware against fine china. Outside the ballroom windows, the last colors of the evening sky melted into deep shades of blue, while inside, candlelight painted every table with a quiet warmth that somehow made the distance between people seem even more noticeable. Emily found herself studying Daniel without meaning to. She had met generous people before. She had met polite people, patient people, and even people who wanted to appear compassionate because others were watching. Daniel felt different. There was no performance in the way he listened. No calculation behind his smile. He spoke with the same calm sincerity whether he was talking to the event host, the waiter refilling their glasses, or Lily describing how one of her sunflowers had grown taller than she was. Emily had forgotten what ordinary conversation felt like. For years, every interaction eventually circled back to her scars. Someone would lower their voice. Someone would apologize for asking. Someone would tell her how brave she was. Daniel had done none of those things. Instead, he asked whether she preferred mountains or the ocean, whether she enjoyed reading historical novels, and whether she had ever tried homemade apple pie with sharp cheddar cheese, because Lily insisted it was the best combination in the world. Emily laughed again, a little louder this time. "I have never heard of that." Lily gasped dramatically. "Then we have to fix that." Daniel chuckled. "Apparently, that is now part of our mission." Emily smiled so naturally that she did not realize several nearby guests had quietly stopped watching the stage and started watching their table instead. It puzzled them. They could not understand why a woman they had spent years avoiding suddenly looked lighter simply because someone had treated her like everyone else. Emily slowly turned toward Daniel. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," he answered. She hesitated, searching for words she had not spoken aloud in a very long time. "When you walked across the room, were you not worried about what everyone might think?" Daniel rested his fork on his plate and considered the question carefully. He never rushed answers that mattered. When Hannah was still alive, he said gently. She used to tell me that every person is carrying a story we cannot see. After she passed away, I realized something else. Emily listened without looking away. Lily quietly reached for her glass, sensing that her father was about to say something important. Daniel continued in the same calm voice that never needed to become louder to be heard. People spend too much time asking whether someone deserves kindness. I think the better question is whether kindness deserves to depend on appearances. Emily lowered her eyes, feeling tears gather before she could stop them. Daniel noticed, but did not pretend not to see. He simply offered her a neatly folded linen napkin without a single awkward word. She accepted it with trembling fingers. I am sorry, she whispered. Daniel smiled gently. Please do not apologize for being human. Emily laughed softly through the tears. You make it sound so simple. He shook his head. It is simple. It is not always easy. Silence settled over the table, but unlike the silence she had grown accustomed to, this one carried comfort instead of loneliness. Nearby conversations gradually quieted as more guests realized Emily was crying. Several assumed she had become upset. They could not hear Daniel's words, only see the kindness with which he had spoken them. Emily carefully wiped her eyes before looking at him again. Do you know what surprises me most? She asked. Daniel tilted his head slightly. She smiled through the remaining tears. You never once looked at my scars. Daniel's expression remained warm and steady. That is because every time I looked at you, he replied softly, I kept meeting your eyes first, and they told me everything I wanted to know. Emily's words lingered gently over the table, and for a long moment no one felt the need to speak. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations were measured not by the number of sentences exchanged, but by the peace that remained afterward. The orchestra began another quiet arrangement, the violin carrying a melody so soft it blended with the glow of candlelight and the faint fragrance of fresh roses decorating the ballroom. Lily looked from her father to Emily with the uncomplicated wisdom only children sometimes possessed. She could not fully understand everything the adults were feeling, but she understood enough to recognize when someone had been lonely for a very long time. Slowly, she slipped her small hand into the pocket of her light blue cardigan and carefully pulled out a braided friendship bracelet woven from pale blue, white, and lavender threads. It was slightly uneven, with one loose knot near the center, the unmistakable work of a child determined to make something beautiful. Daniel noticed it immediately. I thought you were saving that for someone special, he said softly. Lily smiled without hesitation. I am. She turned toward Emily and held out the bracelet with both hands. Emily blinked in surprise. For me? Lily nodded. I made it last week. Emily looked at the tiny bracelet as though it were something far more valuable than precious jewelry. It is beautiful, she whispered. Lily grinned proudly. Daddy says handmade things are special because they carry part of your heart. Daniel laughed quietly. I do say that. Emily accepted the bracelet with careful fingers, almost afraid she might somehow damage it. Are you sure? She asked gently. Lily answered with complete certainty. Yes, I think it belongs to you. Emily carefully tied the bracelet around her wrist, her hands trembling slightly as the colorful threads settled against her skin. She stared at it for several seconds before looking back at Lily. No one has given me a friendship bracelet since I was a little girl. Lily reached across the table and wrapped both of her small hands around Emily's hand. Then maybe it was time for another one. Daniel lowered his eyes for just a moment, allowing himself to absorb the quiet beauty of what had happened. Around them, several nearby guests had begun watching without speaking. There was something disarming about witnessing kindness that expected nothing in return. It made excuses feel smaller. Across the ballroom, one elderly woman discreetly removed her reading glasses and dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a linen napkin. Even the photographer who had taken their picture paused before lifting his camera again, sensing that this moment belonged more to memory than to a photograph. Emily gently squeezed Lily's hand. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I will treasure this for the rest of my life. Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. Will you come visit our butterfly garden when it grows next spring? Emily smiled, surprised by how quickly hope could appear inside a sentence. I would love that. Lily looked at Daniel with excitement. Can she, Daddy? Daniel smiled warmly. That decision is not mine. He turned toward Emily. The invitation is real, but there is never any pressure. Friends should always have room to say yes or no. Emily looked first at Lily, then at Daniel, before quietly laughing through another tear. I cannot remember the last time someone invited me somewhere without making me feel like a burden. Daniel gently shook his head. Emily, the people who bring light into a room are never a burden. She lowered her gaze to the small bracelet resting against her wrist, and for the first time in years, she found herself believing that perhaps the hardest seasons of life were not always the final chapter. The evening settled into a peaceful rhythm, yet something unseen had already begun to change. Guests who had spent the first hour avoiding Emily's table now found themselves glancing toward it again and again, not because of curiosity anymore, but because they could not understand why she seemed different. The scars had not disappeared. Her dress had not changed. The only thing that had changed was the way someone had chosen to see her. That realization quietly unsettled the room. As dessert plates were being cleared away, the chairman of the foundation stepped onto the stage carrying a slim leather folder. His silver hair caught the light as he adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the audience. Before we conclude this evening, he said, there is one person whose work has shaped this foundation more than most of you realize. Polite applause followed. Many guests assumed another major donor was about to be recognized. Instead, the chairman looked directly toward Emily. Dr. Emily Carter, would you please join me for just a moment? Emily froze. Her smile faded into quiet uncertainty. Recognition had never been something she sought. In fact, she usually asked to remain anonymous whenever possible. Daniel noticed the hesitation in her eyes. Only if you want to, he said gently. Emily nodded almost imperceptibly before standing. Lily gave her hand a tiny, encouraging squeeze. You can do it. Emily walked slowly toward the stage. The ballroom became unexpectedly quiet, every heel against the polished floor echoing through the silence. The chairman waited until she reached him before opening the leather folder. Many people know Dr. Carter as the director of this foundation, he began. Far fewer know why she accepted this role. He paused, allowing the room to settle even further. Years ago, during an emergency at the Children's Hospital where she served as a pediatric physician, Dr. Carter stayed behind to make certain every child in her care was safely evacuated before leaving herself. No dramatic words followed. None were needed. The chairman simply closed the folder and continued. The injuries she received permanently changed her appearance. They never changed her character. A stillness spread across the ballroom unlike anything earlier that evening. Several guests slowly lowered their eyes. The businessman who had questioned Daniel's motives stared silently at the tablecloth before him. The woman wearing diamond earrings remembered every careless whisper she had spoken over the past several years. None of them could erase those moments now. The chairman smiled at Emily with unmistakable respect. After recovering, she quietly dedicated her life to helping children receive medical care regardless of their family's income. Thousands of young patients have received treatment because of her leadership. Most of them will never know her name. That is exactly how she wanted it. Applause began somewhere near the back of the room. One pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. It was not the loud, polished applause that often followed generous donations. It was slower, more thoughtful, more honest. Emily looked out across the crowd, her eyes filling with tears once again, but this time they were different. They carried relief instead of loneliness. She searched the audience until she found Daniel and Lily. Neither of them clapped first. They were already standing before anyone else had risen, smiling with quiet pride as though the woman on that stage had never needed permission to be admired. Daniel did not look surprised by what he had learned. He simply looked grateful that the rest of the room had finally been introduced to the person he had already seen from the very beginning. Emily remained on the stage for another quiet moment, her fingers lightly resting against the simple friendship bracelet Lily had tied around her wrist only minutes earlier. Somehow, among all the applause, the expensive jewelry in the room, and the glittering crystal chandeliers overhead, that uneven little bracelet felt like the greatest honor she had received all evening. The chairman thanked her once more before stepping aside, allowing the audience to continue applauding. When Emily finally returned to the table, several guests instinctively stepped into her path. Earlier that evening they had avoided even making eye contact. Now they searched for words that refused to come easily. The businessman who had whispered that Daniel was trying too hard slowly stood from his chair. His confident smile had disappeared. "Dr. Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Emily looked at him with gentle curiosity rather than resentment. He lowered his head. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I am ashamed of that." A woman wearing sparkling diamonds approached next. Her eyes were moist, and she held her folded napkin tightly in both hands. "I told myself I was only being curious," she admitted softly. "The truth is, I forgot that every scar belongs to a human being, not a conversation." Emily smiled with quiet grace. "Thank you." She spoke only those two words. No lecture, no accusation, no attempt to make anyone feel smaller than they already did. Daniel watched silently from beside Lily, understanding that forgiveness often carried more strength than anger ever could. Soon several more guests gathered around the table, each offering awkward but sincere apologies. Some thanked Emily for her years of service. Others simply admitted they had been wrong. Throughout it all, Emily answered with patience that reflected the compassion she had carried long before anyone had applauded her name. Then one guest turned toward Daniel. "You knew none of this," he said. "You had no idea who she was." Daniel nodded. "That is true." The man looked genuinely puzzled. "Then why did you cross the room when everyone else stayed away?" Daniel glanced toward Emily before answering. His voice remained calm enough that those standing nearby leaned closer to hear. "Because respect should never depend on information we have not learned yet." The small circle around the table fell completely silent. Daniel continued without the slightest trace of pride. "If kindness only begins after we discover someone's achievements, then we are not honoring their character. We are rewarding their resume." Several people quietly lowered their eyes. Those words settled into the room with more weight than any speech delivered from the stage that evening. Emily looked at Daniel with unmistakable gratitude, but before she could speak, one guest asked the question everyone else seemed to be wondering. "Do you not think people deserve to know everything she has done?" Daniel smiled gently and shook his head. "Her life is not a performance for our comfort. The remarkable things she has done explain her courage, but they are not the reason she deserves respect." He paused briefly before adding, "She deserved that respect before any of us knew her story." No one answered. They could not. The ballroom had grown so quiet that the distant notes of the piano once again became the loudest sound in the room. Lily looked around at the adults surrounding their table and whispered with innocent honesty, "Daddy always tells me that the nicest people are usually the ones carrying the heaviest stories." Emily reached across the table and gently held Lily's little hand. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time no one saw weakness in it. They saw healing. And for many in that ballroom, they realized that the greatest miracle of the evening was not discovering who Emily Carter had always been. It was finally seeing the kind of people they themselves still had the chance to become. 1 year passed with the quiet certainty that often follows a single act of genuine kindness. Spring arrived exactly as Lily had hoped it would, filling the small garden behind Daniel's white farmhouse with colorful butterflies drifting gently among rows of lavender, daisies, and bright yellow sunflowers. The little wooden bench Daniel had built beside the flower beds had become everyone's favorite place to share coffee, stories, and peaceful evenings beneath the wide American sky. Emily visited often at first. Sometimes she brought homemade soup after long days at the foundation. Sometimes she arrived carrying books she thought Lily would enjoy. Other times, she simply came to sit in comfortable silence while Daniel repaired an old rocking chair on the porch and Lily chased butterflies across the yard. No one rushed anything. No one tried to force the future. Trust grew the same way Daniel believed every strong piece of furniture should be built, patiently, one careful piece at a time. Before long, the people in Maple Ridge noticed something they had not expected. Emily laughed more often. She stopped hiding whenever someone reached for a camera. She volunteered at the community clinic again, smiling at frightened children with the same gentle confidence she had carried years before. The scars on her face remained exactly the same. Only the way people looked at them had changed. Or perhaps the greater change was that Emily no longer allowed other people's opinions to decide how brightly she would live. On a warm Saturday afternoon exactly 1 year after the charity gala, family and friends gathered beneath towering maple trees in the town park for a simple wedding. There were no extravagant decorations, no famous guests, and no elaborate displays of wealth. Fresh wildflowers rested in glass jars along the wooden aisle. Children laughed as they scattered white flower petals across the grass. Neighbors brought homemade pies, fresh lemonade, and warm smiles instead of expensive gifts. Daniel stood waiting beneath a small arbor built with his own hands, its beams crafted from the same maple wood he had saved for something truly meaningful. When Emily appeared, wearing an elegant ivory dress that reflected the afternoon sunlight, every conversation faded into silence. Not because people were surprised by her scars anymore, but because they finally saw what had always been there. Grace, quiet strength, unshakable dignity. Lily proudly carried a small bouquet almost as large as she was. When she reached Emily, she wrapped both arms around her before whispering softly enough that only Emily could hear. "I told you the bracelet belonged to you." Emily smiled through happy tears. "It always will." During the ceremony, the minister spoke about love that listens before it judges and about families built not only by circumstance, but by daily choices of kindness. Daniel took Emily's hands and looked into her eyes with the same calm warmth that had crossed an entire ballroom 1 year earlier. "Thank you," he said gently, "for reminding us that the strongest hearts are often the quietest ones." Emily smiled. "And thank you for seeing me before you knew my story." After they exchanged their vows, Lily stepped between them with the confidence only a child filled with love could possess. She reached for Emily's hand, then Daniel's, joining them together before looking up with shining eyes. "Can I call you Mom now?" Tears filled Emily's eyes instantly. She knelt to embrace Lily with both arms, holding her close as though protecting the greatest gift she had ever received. "I would be honored," she whispered. Around them, many of the same people who had once laughed, whispered, or looked away quietly wiped tears from their eyes. They had arrived expecting to witness a wedding. Instead, they witnessed redemption. As the evening sunlight settled across the park and butterflies drifted gently through the garden beyond, Daniel realized something that could never be measured by applause or recognition. Kindness had not changed Emily. Kindness had simply given the world permission to finally see the remarkable woman she had always been. And the room that had once searched for reasons to judge her had learned, at last, that the greatest beauty any person could carry was the quiet dignity of a heart that never stopped choosing love.